The house stood tall, proud, and rich with history, a colonial masterpiece built brick by James' great-grandfather after he returned from World War II. Its walls had witnessed generations of laughter, love, and loss. It had been the backdrop of every major moment in the family's history: holiday gatherings where kids played in the snow-covered yard, summer nights spent on the wide front porch with glasses of iced tea, and quiet evenings when James' late wife would sit by the window, gazing at the stars. It wasn't just a house. It was a home filled with memories, a sanctuary that had stood firm even when life got hard. But to the HOA, it was nothing more than an obstacle, an outdated structure standing in the way of their grand vision. And unfortunately for them, the man who owned that house was no ordinary homeowner. He was a decorated U.S. Army general, currently stationed overseas, serving his country with unwavering dedication. But while he was away protecting the nation, a different kind of battle was brewing back home, one he never saw coming. The HOA, drunk on power and arrogance, believed James' absence meant opportunity. They thought they could steal a piece of history without a fight. They thought wrong. Karen Matthews had ruled over the neighborhood like a self-proclaimed queen. With her manicured nails tapping away on her designer phone, she controlled the HOA board like a puppeteer, bending rules, rewriting regulations, and approving projects that somehow always benefited her and her husband's construction company. She had spent years weaving a web of power, convincing homeowners that her way was the only way. And now, she had set her sights on something bigger: a grand community center, a modern, multi-million-dollar complex that would elevate property values and beautify the neighborhood. At least, that's how she sold it to the other board members. But what she didn't advertise was the dirty secret behind the project. The location of this so-called improvement had already been decided, long before the official vote had taken place. The land for her dream project? James' home, his historic family home, which she had carefully marked as structurally unsound in official reports she had manipulated, all while whispering in the ears of investors about prime real estate opportunities. She had done this before: pushed out homeowners with minor violations, forced them into selling, and conveniently had her husband's company handle the renovations. But James wasn't just another homeowner, and his house wasn't just another building. Karen's plan had one problem: James still legally owned the house. But that wasn't an issue for her. She had a playbook, one she had used countless times before. She knew military personnel had special legal protections under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, which prevented their homes from being seized while they were deployed. But Karen was nothing if not meticulous. She dug deep, looking for any loophole she could exploit, and she found one. The act required a formal, legally mandated notice before any action could be taken against a deployed service member's property. But Karen, being the expert manipulator she was, ensured that James' notices were sent to an old address, one she knew he wouldn't receive. She used delays, red tape, and backdoor dealings to keep things quiet, all while fast-tracking her own plans. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it would be too late. She counted on James being too far away, too distracted by his duty, to stop her. After all, what could a soldier do when he was thousands of miles from home? But she underestimated one thing: James wasn't just a soldier. He was a man who had spent his life strategizing and leading in high-stakes situations. And when he finally learned what was happening, Karen would wish she had picked any other house in the neighborhood. The neighborhood had seen this kind of thing before. A family fights the HOA and suddenly, their mailbox is 2 inches too tall. Their grass is deemed too dry, and citations start piling up faster than they can pay them. The people who had once stood up against Karen had all fallen, buried under legal fees, fake violations, and sudden, unexplained foreclosure threats. Nobody wanted to be next. So, when James' cousin noticed Karen circling James' property like a vulture, taking photos and muttering about standards, he wasn't surprised. He watched from his window, coffee in hand, knowing full well that something wasn't right. The next day, he overheard Karen talking to a group of investors, boasting about how this whole block would be transformed. And just like that, the fear set in. James' cousin knew he had to do something. But the problem was, standing up to Karen meant putting a target on your back. And fighting the HOA wasn't just about filing complaints. It was about going up against a system designed to crush anyone who got in its way. The first letter arrived just days later. A formal warning from the HOA, citing numerous violations on James' property, violations that hadn't been an issue for decades. The paint color, which had been approved by the board 3 years prior, was now unauthorized. The antique brass knocker, which had been on the door since James' grandfather's time, was suddenly not in compliance. The rose bushes, which James' daughter had planted before he was deployed, were now deemed invasive species. It was a flood of nonsense, but it wasn't random. It was a strategy, a relentless attack designed to wear the homeowner down, to push them to the point where selling was their only option. But James wasn't even there to fight back. His cousin tried, making phone calls, sending emails, even presenting proof that the violations were baseless. But the HOA was a fortress, and Karen was a queen. Every response was the same. This matter has already been decided. That's when he realized they weren't trying to get James to comply. They were trying to erase him entirely. James' cousin did the only thing he could. He reached out. He called James' daughter, Sarah, who was away at college. "Something's wrong," he told her. "They're planning something big, and they're moving fast." Sarah's voice trembled. "But my dad's coming home in 2 weeks," she said. "They can't just take our house, right?" That's when it hit them. Karen had timed everything down to the last detail. The final vote on the demolition was scheduled for just 13 days before James' return, 1 day short of the 2-week legal protection for deployed service members. It was no accident. Karen had spent months orchestrating this, making sure that by the time James stepped off his flight, his home would already be rubble. James' cousin scrambled to stop it, contacting lawyers, reaching out to city officials, even going through old HOA records to find anything that could delay the demolition. But Karen had covered her tracks too well. And as the hours ticked by, the reality sank in. He was running out of time. James' cousin barely slept in the nights leading up to the HOA's final vote. He stayed up researching laws, calling every legal aid office he could find, hoping for a miracle. But Karen was always a step ahead. On the morning of the vote, he arrived at the HOA meeting armed with a folder full of documents proving that James' home was legally protected. But the board members barely glanced at it before voting unanimously to proceed. The decision was made. The bulldozers were coming. "It's all perfectly legal," Karen said with that sickly sweet smile. "You should take pictures for the memories." That night, James' cousin stood outside the house, staring at its walls, at the window where James' late wife had spent her final days, at the porch where Sarah had learned to ride a bike. He refused to believe this was the end. At 6:30 a.m., the sound of heavy machinery roared through the street. 3 yellow bulldozers, a demolition crew, and 2 police cars. The fight was over, or so they thought, because what they didn't know was that James had just landed. And he wasn't coming alone. Want the next part? Let me know. The first thing James saw when he pulled up was the sickening sight of his family home being torn apart. He barely had time to process the wreckage before he noticed her, Karen Matthews, standing smugly off to the side in her designer outfit, tapping away on her phone, already discussing the next phase of her grand project. The demolition crew was in full swing, the bulldozers clawing into the walls that had sheltered 4 generations of his family. But what Karen had failed to consider, what her arrogance had blinded her to, was that James was no ordinary homeowner. He wasn't just some man returning to a ruined house. He was a U.S. Army general, a man who had commanded troops in war zones, a man who had learned the art of battle not in boardrooms but in combat. And he hadn't come alone. As he stepped out of the car, the demolition crew's movement slowed, their faces going pale as they realized who was standing before them. James wasn't just another resident caught in Karen's web. He was a man with connections, and the moment he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, Karen's confidence shattered. "Bill," he said, his voice calm but ice cold. "Get down here. Now." The name alone made Karen's face drain of color. Senator Bill Williams, a longtime advocate for veteran rights. A man who did not take kindly to corrupt HOA boards bulldozing the homes of service members. And he was already on his way. James had fought real battles. He had looked warlords in the eye, negotiated peace in rooms filled with men who wanted him dead. But never had he felt a fury like this. As he stepped toward Karen, the weight of his family's loss pressed into his chest, but he didn't explode. No, his anger was far more dangerous. It was precise, controlled, and deliberate. "Ma'am," he said, his tone so polite it made Karen flinch. "I believe you're standing on my property." He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a weathered document, a deed dating back to 1947, proof that this land had belonged to his family for generations. "I'm curious," he continued, his voice steady. "When exactly did the HOA acquire the right to demolish it?" Karen, for the first time in her life, stammered. She waved her stack of HOA documents like a shield, blurting out legal jargon and throwing around words like board approval and unanimous vote. But James wasn't listening. He was already dialing another number, this time putting Karen on speakerphone for everyone to hear. "Yes, sir," he said. "This is General James Matthews. I need a legal team and the media here immediately. Also, start an inquiry into how an HOA board is overriding federal protections for deployed service members." Karen's breath hitched, and that was before James mentioned the most damning part. His home was protected under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, a federal law that Karen had just blatantly violated. For years, Karen had ruled with an iron fist, her power unchecked. But today, the fear that had silenced the neighborhood was gone. The moment James stood his ground, something changed. A shift in the air. Neighbors, once too afraid to speak out, finally stepped forward. A young woman named Sarah from 3 doors down hesitated before raising her phone. "I have videos," she said. "They started demolition before you got back." They ignored the legal notices. Another neighbor, an elderly man who had lived in the area for decades, spoke up next. "I heard Karen on the phone last night. She was making sure the crew started before you could stop them. Then it was like a floodgate burst open. Homeowners began handing James proof, emails, voice recordings, screenshots of meetings where Karen had rigged votes. One man produced a copy of a backdated violation notice Karen had used to push out another military family last year. It was an avalanche of evidence, and James collected it all, his mind already forming a plan. Meanwhile, Karen's facade was crumbling. She had controlled these people for years, but now, standing in front of the man she had underestimated, she had nowhere to hide. By the time Senator Williams arrived, the street was flooded with news vans. Cameras rolled as James presented his case, showing the world exactly how Karen and her corrupt board had targeted veterans, manipulated legal loopholes, and abused their power. "These people," James said, gesturing to his neighbors, "deserve better, and we will make sure they get justice." Karen, now visibly panicked, tried one last desperate move. She pulled out an HOA rule book and waved it frantically. "Page 394, she screeched. "The board has emergency powers to remove hazardous structures." But James had had enough. He stepped forward, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Karen," he said, his words razor-sharp, "my great-grandfather built this house with his own hands after returning from war. Tell me, what exactly was the emergency?" Silence. Her lips parted, but no words came. The cameras zoomed in, and then, as if the universe itself had decided to put an end to her reign, a local mailman stepped forward with one final piece of evidence, an audio recording of Karen and her husband before the vote, measuring James' property and planning the layout of their so-called community center. And that was the moment Karen knew. It was over. Karen had spent years believing she was untouchable. But standing in the wreckage of the home she had destroyed, with James towering over her, with the law closing in, she realized the truth. She had made a fatal mistake. She had underestimated the wrong man. Within hours, state officials had launched an investigation into the HOA. The legal team James had called, they were already filing lawsuits. And the media? Oh, they were eating this up. Decorated General's home demolished in HOA power play was already trending nationwide. Karen had dreamed of making headlines, but not like this. But the real victory wasn't just about bringing Karen down. It was about sending a message that veterans, service members, and everyday homeowners would no longer be bullied by corrupt HOAs. "This is bigger than me," James said to the cameras. "This is about making sure no other family has to go through this again." Karen had spent years tearing people down. But now, the community was coming together to build something greater. In the weeks that followed, something incredible happened. Contractors and volunteers, many of them veterans, began showing up, offering to rebuild James' home for free. Donations poured in. Businesses stepped up. Even the mayor came by to help lay the foundation. And this time, the house wouldn't just be rebuilt. It would be protected, designated as a historical landmark, ensuring that no one could ever touch it again. The community, once divided by fear, had come together in a way Karen had never anticipated. And as for the land Karen had wanted for her community center, it wasn't going to luxury condos anymore. James donated it to build affordable housing for veterans transitioning back into civilian life. James could have walked away, satisfied with his personal victory, but he knew this fight wasn't over. Because for every corrupt HOA that got caught, there were 100 more still operating unchecked. So, he and his cousin founded something new, the Homeowners Defense Alliance, an organization dedicated to protecting veterans and homeowners from HOA abuse. And their first mission? Investigating the dozens of other military families who had been targeted by Karen's husband's construction company. It wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about changing the system. And that was the greatest victory of all. As for Karen, she and her husband were arrested for fraud, conspiracy, and multiple federal violations. Her legacy would not be the grand community center she had envisioned. It would be the Matthews Act, a new law protecting deployed service members from predatory HOAs. And that was justice.